Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
And today, we have a really profound topic to get into.
We do. We're exploring a premise that is, frankly, pretty unsettling. Think about this. A democracy built to resist tyranny created institutions that could operate completely beyond democratic oversight.
Right.
So the question for you, the listener, is this. How does a system designed to defend freedom end up functioning in total secrecy?
It's the defining paradox of the modern national security state, honestly. And for this deep dive, we are analyzing the structural history detailed in our source material, which is Area 51, an uncensored history of America's top secret military base by Annie Jacobsen.
Yeah.
And our goal today is to really analyze the physical and the bureaucratic reality of this specific location.
And right out of the gate, I want to establish something with you. You already know all the pop culture myths, right?
Well, yeah, everyone does.
When you hear the words Area 51, society has completely conditioned you to picture little green men, crash flying saucers, sci-fi movies. But we aren't here to talk about Hollywood aliens today. We want to skip past all that folklore and look directly at the Nevada Test and Training Range as a physical, geographical fortress.
And a bureaucratic black hole.
Yes, more importantly, a bureaucratic black hole. Because the actual truth of what was built out there in the desert is infinitely more consequential to your daily life than any science fiction story could ever be.
Yeah, I mean, to understand the sheer magnitude of this bureaucratic black hole, we first kind of have to grasp its physical footprint.
Right.
Geographically speaking, Area 51 sits inside the Nevada Test and Training Range. Just to give you a sense of the scale we're dealing with here, this contiguous block of government-controlled land encompasses 4,687 square miles.
That is, wait, 4,600.
4,687. It is nearly the size of the entire state of Connecticut.
Wow.
It is essentially a sovereign state within the United States, completely walled off from public access, and nested right inside this massive expanse is the Nevada Test Site.
Which has its own crazy history.
Oh, absolutely. Between 1951 and 1992, the government detonated 105 nuclear weapons above ground, like directly into the atmosphere, and they exploded another 828 nuclear weapons underground.
Let's just pause on that number for a second, because it's hard to even visualize. Over 900 nuclear detonations.
Yeah.
You're talking about a level of geographical and environmental engineering that literally alters the bedrock of the Earth.
Exactly. And Area 51 sits roughly 5 miles to the northeast of the northernmost corner of that heavily irradiated test site.
Just right next door.
Right next door. Every single operation that occurs at Area 51 and the vast majority of activities across the broader testing range are strictly classified in real time.
Which means no one sees it.
No one. The secrecy is so enduring that even today, if you look through thousands of pages of declassified memos and historical reports from the CIA, the actual name Area 51 is still heavily redacted.
That is wild to me.
The ink is just blacked out. The government released the documents, but they still refuse to print the name of the base. And the reason this matters to you isn't because of UFO hunting. It is because Area 51 serves as the ultimate historical case study in a very specific type of statecraft.
Right.
We are analyzing how modern nations design structural systems that are capable of pursuing immense, world-altering technological power while remaining totally structurally invisible to the very societies whose tax dollars fund them.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand how we arrived at a point where a military installation the size of Connecticut can operate completely in the shadows, we have to trace the architecture of secrecy back to its absolute origin.
Really do.
We have to look at the mother of all black projects, which is the Manhattan Project. I was looking at the source material, and the scale of this operation during World War II is just mind-boggling.
It's unprecedented.
When you adjust for inflation, the effort to build the first atomic bomb cost $28 billion. It employed roughly 200,000 workers distributed across 80 different offices and dozens of production plants all over the country.
It was an entire shadow economy.
Yeah.
Just operating simultaneously alongside the legitimate wartime economy. I mean, you had hundreds of thousands of Americans clocking in every day, receiving paychecks, operating heavy machinery, refining materials.
And they had no idea.
None. The vast majority of them had absolutely no conceptual understanding of what the final product was going to be.
And the physical infrastructure required to pull this off was staggering. There was a 60,000-acre facility in rural Tennessee that was pulling more power off the national electrical grid than the entire city of New York on any given night.
That detail is just incredible.
Well, let that sink in for you. Imagine you're managing the power grid for the Eastern Seaboard in 1944. You have an energy draw massive enough to light up millions of homes, powering subways and skyscrapers, and that exact amount of electricity is just vanishing into a patch of rural Tennessee.
And yet no one in the general public knew it was there.
That demonstrates the sheer, terrifying efficiency of a properly executed black operation.
But the most profound shock to the democratic system wasn't just that a massive facility in Tennessee was kept hidden from the American public.
What was it then?
It was the total oversight vacuum this secrecy created at the very highest echelons of elected government. When the U.S. finally dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, the U.S. Congress was completely stunned.
They had no clue.
The legislative branch of the government had absolutely no idea that this $28 billion engineering marvel was even being developed.
But hold on, it wasn't just the broader Congress that was kept in the dark, right? Even the vice president didn't know.
Exactly.
And this is the part that genuinely baffles me. Harry Truman had zero idea the atomic bomb existed until Franklin D. Roosevelt died in April of 1945.
It's almost hard to believe.
How is that possible? I mean, Truman wasn't just the vice president. Before taking that office, he was literally the chairman of a Senate committee specifically established to investigate the National Defense Program.
Right.
His exact job description was to track down wasteful military spending and oversee wartime contracts. How do you hide a $28 billion hole from the guy whose literal job is to audit the war effort?
It highlights the absolute supremacy of compartmentalization.
It really does.
The system of secrecy was so robustly designed that it successfully blinded the chief financial watchdog of the United States Senate. Truman only found out about the weapon that would define his presidency after he was sworn in as commander-in-chief.
And Congress didn't even tell him.
No, the information wasn't even given to him by a Democratic body. It was quietly relayed to him by unelected insiders, specifically Vannevar Bush, the president's science advisor, and Henry L. Stimson, the Secretary of War.
So imagine your Congress at the end of World War II. You suddenly realize you have been entirely cut out of the loop on the most destructive weapon in human history. Your immediate, logical reaction should be, never again. We need absolute transparency, strict financial audits, and total democratic oversight from here on out.
And that was the initial public sentiment. Congress realized they needed to establish stewardship over this unimaginable destructive power.
Sure.
So in 1946, they passed the Atomic Energy Act. This legislation formally shifted control of the atomic arsenal away from the military and handed it to a brand new civilian-run agency called the Atomic Energy Commission, or the AEC.
The idea being that civilians are safer.
Right. The prevailing logic was that putting civilians in charge would inherently make the process more democratic, more transparent, and just generally more accountable to the people. But the reality of what the AEC became was the exact opposite.
It always is.
Rather than opening the doors, the creation of the AEC birthed an unprecedented, impenetrable fortress of secrecy. It formalized a system that operated completely outside normal democratic boundaries.
Which brings us to a legal concept from the source material that absolutely blew my mind. It's this idea of born classified information.
Oh yeah, this is crucial.
Think about how intellectual property normally works. If you invent a new type of engine, you file a patent, you claim ownership.
Right.
But under the AEC system, imagine you're a physicist sitting in your own living room. You're sketching out some theoretical math on a notepad. You have a brand new idea regarding atomic energy. Under this legal framework, the very millisecond that original thought pops into your head, the government legally deems it a state secret.
Instantly.
You didn't steal a document from a vault. You didn't photograph a blueprint. Your own original organic thought is instantly classified the moment it exists.
What's fascinating here is how this born classified mechanism fundamentally bypassed the established chain of command.
How so?
Well, traditionally, the rules for what constituted a national security secret were determined by the President of the United States through executive orders.
Yeah.
The President set the standard, but the Atomic Energy Act of 1946 granted this new civilian-run AEC the unprecedented legal authority to regulate the classification of all nuclear-related information entirely on its own, utilizing its own criteria, completely independent of presidential control.
They essentially built a parallel government.
They did. It meant the AEC could go out and hire a private commercial company to conduct research, and every single piece of data, every conceptual breakthrough generated by that private company was highly classified by default.
Wow.
The system granted professional classification officers an unanswerable structural authority. And this leads us to a massive historical bombshell, presented in our source text.
Let's hear it.
For decades, pop culture and even military historians have broadly assumed that the CIA was the original architect of Area 51, but that is historically false.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the CIA was not Area 51's first customer. It was the Atomic Energy Commission.
No kidding.
Beginning in 1951, the AEC utilized its legally bulletproof parallel system of secret-keeping to conduct operations in the Nevada desert. And they weren't just working on nuclear yields. They were conducting radical, highly controversial research involving aircraft and the pilots who flew them, operating entirely without traditional military oversight or standard ethical controls.
Which, if you think about it, is an absolutely brilliant bureaucratic shell game.
Well, it's genius.
If you're developing a highly experimental, shadowy aviation project, you don't house it within the U.S. Air Force, because that is exactly where a spy or investigative journalist would look for a secret airplane.
Exactly.
You hide your aviation project inside the agency tasked with managing atomic power, because no one in their right mind would look for an experimental airplane hidden inside a nuclear regulatory commission.
It is the perfect example of an information architecture explicitly designed to fragment knowledge. And the tool they use to enforce this fragmentation is the TSSCI system. That stands for Top Secret Sensitive Compartmented Information.
Okay.
It is an incredibly enigmatic, deeply layered security protocol.
Wait, let me make sure I understand the mechanics of TSSCI. From what I read in the text, you're saying the rule book that tells you how to keep a secret is itself a classified secret.
Precisely. Even the classification guides, the literal manuals that instruct a security officer on what elements of a project are secret and why, are themselves classified.
That's a hall of mirrors.
The entire structure of TSSCI is built on a very simple, ruthless premise. Outsiders don't know what they don't know, and insiders only know what they have a strictly defined need to know in order to perform their specific isolated task.
So you only get your tiny piece of the pie.
Right. You could be an elite engineer working on the radar calibration for a new aircraft at Area 51, and you would have absolutely zero idea what the logistics teams are doing in the hangar right next door to you.
Oh.
You were given a piece of the puzzle, but you were legally forbidden from ever seeing the picture on the front of the box.
But to make a sprawling, highly technical architecture of secrecy actually function in the real world, you can't just use bureaucrats. You need trusted insiders.
Yeah, you definitely
You
do.
need people who actually understand the science but are willing to disappear into the black budget. And that introduces us to a fascinating organization in the text. It's called EGNG, which stands for Edgerton, Gemeshausen, and Greer.
Yeah.
What I love about this is that these guys didn't start out as shadowy government operatives wearing trench coats. They were just quirky, brilliant MIT professors.
They really were.
Doc Edgerton actually invented the strobe light technology that made stop-motion photography possible. If you've ever seen those famous, beautiful photographs of a bullet perfectly frozen in time as it pierces an apple, or a single drop of milk splashing up and looking like a perfect little crown, that was Doc Edgerton's work.
Beautiful stuff.
He just wanted to make time stand still so he could study fast-moving objects.
But the reality of the Cold War is that beautiful science rarely stays purely academic for long.
Yeah.
That exact same stop-motion technology was rapidly weaponized. During World War II, EG&G's strobe technology was adapted to illuminate the ground for nighttime aerial reconnaissance bombers before the D-Day invasion.
Wow.
After the war, the Atomic Energy Commission realized that if you can freeze a speeding bullet on film, you can also freeze a nuclear explosion in its earliest microseconds.
That is terrifyingly logical.
EG&G used their ultra-high-speed cameras to photograph nuclear blasts the exact moment detonation occurred. By capturing the geometry of the expanding fireball in fractions of a millisecond, EG&G engineers were the only people on Earth who could mathematically calculate the exact yield, the destructive power of the AEC's nuclear weapons.
Which instantly makes them the most valuable people in the room.
Absolutely.
If you are the only guys who can tell the government if their multi-billion-dollar bombs actually work, you become the ultimate trusted insiders.
They absolutely did. EG&G became the premier go-to contractors for the most highly classified, complex black engineering jobs in the country.
What kind of jobs?
They were tasked with everything from testing radar systems to cleaning up deadly radioactive waste at the Nevada test site. They existed in this strange liminal space. Private citizens wielding immense scientific power while cultivating a culture of absolute, unwavering anonymity.
So you have EG&G out there in the desert quietly running these opaque tests for the AEC. But then the geopolitical landscape shifts and the CIA officially enters the picture.
Right, the 1950s.
In 1955, two high-ranking CIA officers, Richard Bissell and Herbert Miller, are urgently scouting for a location to test a brand new, highly classified espionage project, the U-2 spy plane.
A legendary aircraft.
They are flying in a small plane over the Nevada desert, and they spot Groom Lake. It's this perfectly flat, dry, hardened salt, flat in the middle of absolutely nowhere. They touch down, look around the desolate landscape, and decide they have found the ultimate clandestine test facility.
And what Richard Bissell did next is a masterclass in bureaucratic maneuvering and power consolidation.
Yep.
Bissell didn't just want a runway. He wanted total autonomy. You went directly to President Dwight D. Eisenhower and successfully convinced the president to legally remove the U-2 program from the CIA's own organizational chart.
Wait, he took it off the books.
Entirely off the books. Bissell established Area 51 not as a joint military base, but as a standalone organization. He later wrote in his memoirs that this unique structural designation allowed him to work behind an impenetrable barrier of secrecy.
So no one could tell him what to do.
Exactly. It protected his rapid decision-making process from any interference, oversight, or bureaucratic friction. He didn't just build a secret base. He essentially carved out a piece of sovereign territory at Groom Lake, answerable only to himself and the president.
And the most brazen part of Bissell's strategy is that he intentionally kept the United States Air Force entirely in the dark during the initial planning phases.
That is the craziest part.
Put yourself in the shoes of a top-tier Air Force general in 1955. You have dedicated your life to air superiority. You run the most powerful aviation military force on the planet. And then you slowly find out that a civilian intelligence agency has secretly contracted a state-of-the-art aircraft, and they are out in the Nevada desert test flying it at a base you didn't even know existed.
Yeah.
The institutional resentment must have been off the charts.
The friction was immense. Bissell was playing a very dangerous political game. The CIA eventually realized they couldn't operate a global fleet of spy planes entirely on their own, so they were forced to bring the Air Force into the fold simply because they needed the military's logistical expertise.
Right, for pilot training and global deployment as the U-2 mission scaled up.
Exactly. However, the bureaucratic precedent had been firmly established. The CIA had successfully proven to the executive branch that they could bypass the massive, slow-moving military establishment and run their own cutting-edge covert Air Force.
But then they ran into a new issue.
A very public issue. As soon as those U-2s actually started flying test routes over the United States, they created a massive, entirely unprecedented problem with the American public.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the collision between highly classified aerospace espionage and an anxious, unwary public creates a completely unexpected feedback loop.
It really does.
Almost immediately after the U-2s started flying their test routes out of Area 51, commercial airline pilots and civilian air traffic controllers started frantically flooding the CIA, the Air Force, and the FAA with reports of UFO sightings.
To understand how this happened, you have to accurately picture what those civilian pilots were actually seeing. In the mid-1950s, the cruising altitude for commercial passenger airplanes was generally between 10,000 and 20,000 feet.
Pretty low compared to today.
Right, but the U-2 spy plane was designed to cruise at roughly 70,000 feet, well into the stratosphere.
That's insane.
Furthermore, the early test models of the U-2 were not painted with the matte black radar-absorbing paint we associate with stealth planes today. They were left as bare, unpainted, polished silver metal to save weight.
Ah, I see where this is going.
So you have an aircraft with incredibly long, glider-like wings flying at an altitude no one thought was possible. As the sun began to set on the horizon, the Earth below would be in twilight, but the U-2, way up at 70,000 feet, would still be catching the direct rays of the sun.
Like a mirror.
Exactly. The silver wings would violently reflect that sunlight down to the upper atmosphere. To a commercial pilot looking up through their cockpit window, or a civilian standing on the ground in Nevada or California, it literally looked like a blinding, fiery, flying cross, hovering completely stationary at an impossible height.
It totally bewildered people, and you have to put yourself in the cultural mindset of the 1950s for a second. The public is already primed for panic.
Oh, absolutely.
The modern UFO craze had violently ticked off in 1947 with the mysterious crash at Roswell, New Mexico, and the highly publicized flying saucer sightings by a pilot named Kenneth Arnold over Washington State. On top of that, the nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union was terrifying everyone on a daily basis.
People were on edge.
Kids are doing duck and cover drills under their school desks. People are actively discussing the very real possibility of global Armageddon. Hollywood is relentlessly pumping out movies like The Day the Earth Stood Still and The War of the Worlds.
Right.
The American public was incredibly anxious, highly suggestible, and they rightfully demanded answers from their military about what exactly was hovering in the sky.
And this demand for answers is where we see the machinery of institutional gaslighting fully activate.
That's a great term for it.
The military and the intelligence community's response was a highly coordinated, incredibly cynical dual-track operation.
What were the two tracks?
Well, on one hand, you had the overt, public-facing operation, primarily known as Project Grudge. The Air Force would send officials on television broadcasts and national radio to categorically, emphatically deny that UFOs were anything extraordinary.
Just lie to their faces.
Basically, they looked the American public in the eye and told them they were just seeing weather anomalies, ice crystals, planets, optical illusions, or even, and this is a direct documented quote from their official explanations, flocks of seagulls.
Flocks of seagulls. I'm no ornithologist, but the idea of a flock of seagulls cruising at 70,000 feet, reflecting sunlight like a fiery cross, is just hilariously insulting.
It really is.
They were basically telling commercial airline pilots, men trained to identify aircraft, that they were hallucinating seabirds in the stratosphere.
It was an intentional strategy of ridicule. They were deliberately insulting the public's intelligence to stigmatize the sightings so that credible people would stop reporting them.
And second track.
Behind the scenes, on the covert track, the military took these exact same sightings incredibly seriously. While they were mocking people on television, they were quietly launching highly classified investigations with names like Project Sign, Project Twinkle, and later the famous Project Blue Book.
So they were investigating themselves.
They were dedicating immense resources to tracking phenomena they called green fireballs that kept appearing near highly sensitive nuclear laboratories in New Mexico. They were quietly setting up covert observation posts, staffed with physicists making precise electromagnetic frequency measurements of the sky.
Wow.
They went so far as to secretly distribute special 35mm stereoscopic cameras to civilian air traffic controllers, demanding they photograph anything unusual, and then immediately forcing those same controllers to sign draconian non-disclosure agreements, threatening them with federal prison if they ever spoke about what they saw.
So the system is actively telling the public, you are crazy, you're seeing weather balloons, while simultaneously assigning hundreds of intelligence personnel, spending massive amounts of taxpayer money, and accumulating over 74,000 pages of classified files on the very phenomenon they are publicly claiming does not exist.
Exactly. And if we analyze the systemic benefit of this contradiction, the implications are profoundly disturbing.
How so?
This dynamic created what the famous CIA counterintelligence chief, James Jesus Angleton, referred to as a wilderness of mirrors.
A wilderness of mirrors. I love that.
By intentionally allowing the public to spin wild extraterrestrial conspiracy theories, and by actively feeding into that confusion with absurd cover stories, the institution successfully protected their real classified technological breakthroughs.
They used the conspiracy.
The UFO hysteria wasn't a problem for the CIA at all. It was the perfect, convenient distraction. It served their interests beautifully. The public was structurally cut off from the truth, aggressively looking for Martians and flying saucers, while the Atomic Energy Commission and the CIA quietly built the infrastructure of the modern national security state right in front of them.
The conspiracy theorists essentially became unpaid, unwitting public relations agents for the CIA doing the government's job of obscuring the truth for them.
That's exactly what happened.
And the technology they were hiding only became more extreme, which brings us to the successor of the U-2, the A-12 Ox cart. I have to geek out over this machine for a second because I was reading the technical specifications in the source material, and it genuinely broke my brain.
It's a marvel.
The Ox cart was an aerospace marvel that pushed the absolute boundaries of known physics. It was built from 160,000 pounds of titanium. It was designed to fly at Mach 3.2.
Which is incredibly fast.
That is over 2,300 miles per hour. That means this aircraft was traveling at roughly half a mile per second. And it cruised at altitudes well above 90,000 feet. It was a revolutionary aircraft, technologically 40 years ahead of anything else on the drawing board.
But pushing a 160,000-pound piece of metal through the atmosphere at half a mile per second generates immense kinetic friction.
Yeah, it would get hot.
The skin of the aircraft would heat up to hundreds of degrees, and the massive engines required to maintain that thrust created an enormous heat and radar signature. Richard Bissell at the CIA was absolutely furious when he reviewed the early data and found out that the engine exhaust plume was a massive vulnerability in their stealth concept.
Because it would just light up the Soviet radar screen.
Right. He actually threatened to cancel the entire multi-million-dollar contract with Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works if they couldn't figure out a way to hide that exhaust plume from Soviet radar.
And the solution to this problem is one of my favorite anecdotes from Annie Jacobsen's book. You have this incredibly tense conference room filled with the brightest minds in aviation, and a scientist named Edward Lovick steps up with an idea that sounds like pure magic.
It does sound like magic.
He suggests ionizing the engine gas. He proposed mathematically calibrating a system to inject a chemical compound called cesium directly into the aircraft's fuel mixture just before it ignited.
Okay.
When the fuel burned, the exhaust plume would become ionized, fundamentally changing the electrical charge of the atoms trailing behind the plane. He essentially figured out how to create an invisible sponge out of thin air.
Invisible sponge.
Instead of the Soviet radar waves hitting the dense exhaust gas and bouncing back to the radar dish to reveal the plane's location, the radar waves would just be absorbed and scattered by this ionized gas cloud.
It was a stroke of absolute brilliance. And the underlying physics of that ionization process remained a highly classified component of stealth technology well into the 21st century. But testing an aircraft that extreme, with materials that exotic, comes with extreme operational risks. And when things inevitably went wrong, the lengths the government would go to in order to cover up those failures were astonishing.
That perfectly sets up the crash of CIA pilot Ken Collins. He was out on a test flight in an A-12, pushing the envelope, and the aircraft pitched out of control and went down in the Utah desert.
Plummeted.
Thankfully, Collins managed to eject and survive the crash. But because of the aerodynamic design, the aircraft didn't just break apart into a million pieces in midair. It hit the desert floor at an incredible rate of speed, largely intact, and buried itself deep into the earth.
Right.
Now remember what this plane is made of. It is hand-forged from rare, incredibly expensive titanium, and it is meticulously coated in top-secret radar-absorbing composite materials. If the Soviets or even a local small-town reporter got their hands on a single piece of that wreckage, the absolute cutting-edge secret of American stealth technology could be compromised overnight.
So the CIA could not just call a local tow truck. They mobilized a massive rapid response recovery effort. They had to stage the operation out of an abandoned, decaying World War II airfield nearby. The logistics were incredibly difficult. They had to fly in their own cots, their own cooks, and portable generators because the airfield had no running water or heat.
Just setting up a base from scratch.
Yeah. But the most striking, almost cinematic detail is the method of the actual physical recovery. To ensure not a single trace was left behind, the CIA literally deployed over 100 men on horses into the harsh, freezing desert terrain.
Horses.
For 2 full days, these men scoured every single square inch of the impact zone on horseback. They were picking up every single nut, bolt, shard of glass, and sliver of titanium fuselage, physically erasing the multi-million-dollar crash from the face of the earth.
It's an image straight out of a bizarre sci-fi western. You have government agents riding horses through the sagebrush to recover pieces of a Mach 3 spaceship.
It's surreal.
But while the CIA is out there playing cowboys in the desert to protect their secrets, the bureaucratic warfare back in Washington, D.C. is hitting a boiling point.
The institutional tension finally ruptured. Air Force General Curtis LeMay was a legendary, fiercely proud commander, and he was absolutely furious over the CIA's growing dominance in the sky.
Understandably, from his perspective.
The CIA, a civilian intelligence organization, had successfully built a supersonic marvel that flew higher and faster than anything the military had. The Air Force, whose entire institutional identity is predicated on total air superiority, was being forced to play second fiddle.
And LeMay wasn't going to take that.
LeMay was not the kind of man to accept defeat quietly, so he cornered Kelly Johnson, the legendary aerospace engineer and head of Lockheed's Skunk Works, who designed the A-12 for the CIA. LeMay used the immense weight of the military establishment to essentially blackmail him.
LeMay gives him a brutal ultimatum. He tells Johnson, you stop aggressively lobbying against my favorite bomber programs in Congress, and you take the A-12 design and build a heavier, specialized interceptor version specifically for the Air Force, or I will use all of my political power to completely crush Lockheed's future contracts.
And that forced, hostile compromise is what eventually led to the creation of the famous SR-71 Blackbird, which became the Air Force's version of the plane.
Wow.
But the infighting over who controlled these assets got so vicious that President John F. Kennedy ultimately had to step in. Kennedy realized that having the CIA and the Air Force actively at each other's throats, fighting over jurisdiction of space and aerial espionage, was a massive vulnerability to national security.
So what did he do?
So, in 1961, a highly classified protocol was drafted to force the CIA and the Air Force into a tense bureaucratic marriage. They were ordered to co-manage these advanced surveillance programs. This forced union resulted in the creation of a brand new entity, the National Reconnaissance Office, or the NRO.
Another three-letter alphabet agency to add to the soup?
Yes, but an agency unlike almost any other because the NRO was so highly classified, so deeply buried in the black budget, that its very name, its mere existence as a government entity, was a top-secret fact from its inception in 1961 all the way until it was finally declassified in 1992.
That is just wild to think about.
Think about the implications of that.
Yeah.
The American public paid the salaries, funded the satellite launches, and financed the infrastructure of an entire federal agency, but legally did not know it existed for over 30 years.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is exactly where we start to see the terrifying, wholly predictable outcomes of a structural system that operates entirely without public accountability.
Exactly.
When you build institutions that legally do not have to answer to Congress, that can lie to the press, and that are shielded from the voters, their internal risk tolerance begins to skew into extremely dangerous territory.
They completely lose perspective.
They lose perspective. A perfect example of this unchecked hubris in the text is Operation Argus in 1958.
Operation Argus is perhaps the most chilling example of scientific arrogance protected by the shield of born classified secrecy.
Set the scene for us.
Well, a group of presidential science advisors wanted to test a theoretical physics concept known as the Christopoulos effect. The theory posited that if you detonated nuclear weapons in the vacuum of space, the explosion would interact with the Earth's magnetic field and create an artificial, highly charged radiation belt surrounding the planet.
A radiation belt.
The hope was that this radiation belt would act as an invisible shield, instantly frying the delicate electronics of any incoming Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles before they could re-enter the atmosphere.
So, just to be incredibly clear about this, their brilliant, top-secret plan to protect America from nuclear missiles was to launch their own nuclear missiles from ships stationed in the South Atlantic, fire them directly into space, and detonate them in orbit over the Earth.
That was exactly the plan, and they executed it.
That is madness.
But the test was a failure. The detonations did not create the robust, long-lasting defensive radiation shield they had theorized. However, the system of secrecy protected the architects of the failure.
Of course it did.
James Killian, the president's science advisor, wrote a classified memo to President Eisenhower spinning the entire dangerous debacle as a massive, spectacular success. Instead of focusing on the scientific failure, Killian heavily praised the military for how quickly they organized the launch and, most importantly, congratulated everyone on the fact that they managed to keep the whole thing a secret from the world.
But the wall of secrecy wasn't perfectly sealed. The New York Times managed to get a leak about the space detonations and was preparing to publish.
And this is where the total lack of oversight allows an institution to pivot from simple secrecy to blatant coordinated deception.
Right.
When the White House learned the Times was going to run the story, they went into immediate crisis management. They strategized that if the story broke, it would cause international outrage, especially since they would be brazenly violating their own publicly stated policy of announcing all nuclear tests in advance.
So they needed a cover story.
So the White House decided they would spin the narrative by claiming it wasn't a nuclear weapons test at all. Instead, they told the press it was merely a scientific experiment utilizing a nuclear detonation to discharge electrons into the Earth's magnetic field.
That is pure, cynical semantics.
It really is. They used high-level academic wordplay to give themselves the bureaucratic cover to lie directly to the American people about exploding nuclear bombs in space.
And once you establish that you can get away with that level of deception, the systems of secrecy just naturally keep expanding. Once you have a blank check from the black budget and zero oversight from Congress, why would you ever stop at Area 51?
You wouldn't.
Later on in the timeline, when the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, decided they wanted to develop specialized nuclear bunker busters, weapons specifically engineered to penetrate deep underground facilities before detonating, they realized they needed a new, pristine place to test them.
Because Area 51 was getting crowded.
Right. So the Department of Energy just casually looked at a map and carved out another massive 624 square mile black site near Tonopah, Nevada. They officially designated it Area 52. Just like that, with the stroke of a pen, another massive chunk of American soil disappears behind a wall of security clearances.
It clearly demonstrates that within these bureaucracies, secrecy is not just utilized as a temporary emergency measure to win a specific war.
What does it become?
Over time, secrecy mutates into an institutional instinct for self-preservation. There is a deeply revealing document referenced in the text, unearthed decades after the fact, called the Derry Memo.
Ah, yes, the Derry Memo.
It was written in 1947 by John Derry, who was the general manager of the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission. In this internal memo, Derry explicitly stated that any documents, data, or general knowledge that might cause, quote, embarrassment to the Atomic Energy Commission and or its contractors should be immediately classified as secret or confidential.
Embarrassment.
Let that sink in for a moment. The entire legal classification system, which was sold to the public as a necessary tool to protect national security from Soviet spies, was officially, internally being used to protect a government agency from embarrassment and democratic accountability.
Which brings us to the darkest, most profoundly disturbing secret revealed in the source material, and it showcases the ultimate devastating cost this system exacts from a democracy. Fast forward from the Cold War to the year 1994.
This card is heavy.
It is. An investigative reporter named Eileen Wellsome breaks a horrific Pulitzer Prize-winning story. She reveals that starting in the 1940s, the AEC had secretly injected human test subjects, including pregnant women and hospital patients, with lethal doses of plutonium entirely without their knowledge or informed consent, just to study the biological effects of radiation.
Absolutely horrifying.
President Bill Clinton is absolutely appalled by this revelation. He signs an executive order creating an advisory committee on human radiation experiments to fully investigate the AEC's history and declassify the truth for the American public.
But the President of the United States quickly hit a bureaucratic brick wall.
How is that possible?
When Clinton's investigative committee attempted to access certain specific historical records involving medical programs managed by the AEC and its trusted contractors like EG&G at Area 51, their requests were denied.
Denied to the president.
Why? Because the parallel system of born classified information that was established by the Atomic Energy Act back in 1946 was still functioning exactly as designed. It meant that even the sitting president, the elected commander-in-chief, did not legally possess a need to know.
That is structural dominance.
The architecture of secrecy was so structurally sound that it successfully defended itself against the highest elected office in the land.
So the official, unredacted documents remain locked away in a vault somewhere. But Annie Jacobsen, the author of our source text, managed to track down and interview an unnamed engineer who worked for EG&G. This was a man who was part of an elite, highly cleared group operating at the original Area 51 base back in 1951. And on his deathbed, looking back at his life, he offered a confession that is just. It is incredibly difficult to even process.
It is deeply fundamentally disturbing, and it requires careful analysis.
This engineer confessed that under the direct authority of the AEC and Vannevar Bush, he and other engineers actively participated in covert medical experiments performed on severely handicapped children and prisoners out at Area 51.
That's horrific.
When the author asked him how he could possibly justify participating in such an atrocity, he provided a contextual narrative that sounds like absolute madness. But it was the reality that he and his team were operating under at the time.
Right.
According to this engineer's confession, Joseph Stalin had allegedly sent an aircraft to crash in New Mexico in 1947, the event we now know as the Roswell incident. But the engineer stated it wasn't an alien spaceship. He claimed that his superiors told him Stalin had taken children and biologically and surgically re-engineered them to look like deformed extraterrestrials. The alleged Soviet goal was to drop this craft in America, spark a War of the Worlds-style nationwide panic, and overwhelm America's early warning radar systems with civilian sightings of flying saucers.
We have to be analytically very precise here. We are not validating the historical truth of Stalin's alleged plot. We are analyzing what this EG&G engineer confessed he and his team were told by their superiors in the government.
Exactly.
Whether Stalin actually committed this specific atrocity, or whether this bizarre, horrifying narrative was intentionally constructed by American intelligence officials to mentally condition their own scientists, the systemic outcome is exactly the same.
The outcome is what matters.
The engineer stated that President Truman and Vannevar Bush authorized their own program of human experiments at Area 51 because, quote, we were doing the same thing. They wanted to push science. They wanted to see how far they could go.
The engineer told the author, We did things I wish I had not done. And his only justification, the only way he could sleep at night for decades, was simply that he loved his country, and he was told by the men in charge that these experiments were necessary for the survival of the nation.
This raises an important question, perhaps the single most important question we can ask in this entire deep dive. The real foundational reason the United States government will not officially acknowledge the full history of Area 51 isn't because they're trying to hide the blueprints for the U-2 spy plane or the ox cart or even modern stealth technology.
The math behind stealth is largely understood today anyway.
Right. The real reason is that officially acknowledging the base means openly confronting the precedent of violating the United States Constitution and basic human morality under the impenetrable guise of bourne classified science.
It's about accountability.
This is what happens when knowledge is completely and ruthlessly compartmentalized. When the engineers doing the physical work only ever see their tiny, isolated piece of the puzzle, and when the leaders making the decisions are completely shielded from public oversight and legal accountability, democratic morality simply dies.
It does.
The structural system of secrecy allows otherwise rational, patriotic people to commit atrocities, because the architecture itself removes the burden of personal accountability.
So, as we wrap up this discussion, I want you, the listener, to really consider how you interpret the complex events happening in the world today. When you look up and see unexplainable things in the sky, or when government actions seem completely illogical and opaque, do you jump straight to science fiction?
A lot of people do.
Do you look for aliens and grand supernatural conspiracies? Or do you recognize the massive, invisible, legally protected information architectures operating right beside you every single day? The real story is almost never the flying saucer. The real story is the $28 billion shadow economy, the legal frameworks of compartmented information, and the bureaucratic systems that allow them to exist right under our noses.
I will leave you with a final provocative thought to consider. If the architecture of secrecy, created in 1946 by the Atomic Energy Act, was powerful enough and structurally entrenched enough to legally blind a sitting president of the United States in 1994, how much of our current geopolitical reality right now, today, is being shaped by standalone organizations that legally do not exist?
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
Thanks for listening.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
We appreciate all the support.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
Check that out.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.